What if I told you that in a single heartbeat, in front of hundreds of witnesses, a man who had built his career on firebrand speeches and unshakable conviction was silenced forever? What if I told you that the shooter who pulled the trigger didn't scream, didn't confess, and didn't explain? He simply stood in silence, as if waiting for the darkness to swallow him whole. And what if I told you that when justice finally came, that silence cracked in the most unexpected way, leaving even the hardest hearts in the courtroom shaken? This isn't just another story about crime and punishment. This is about a chilling assassination that played out in broad daylight, about a courtroom scene so dramatic people still argue about what they saw, and about a murderer who seemed untouchable until the weight of a single verdict crushed him to the ground. What if I told you that in a single heartbeat, in front of hundreds of witnesses, a man who had built his career on firebrand speeches and unshakable conviction was silenced forever? What if I told you that the shooter who pulled the trigger didn't scream? What if I told you that in a single heartbeat, in front of hundreds of witnesses, a man who had built his career on firebrand speeches and unshakable conviction was silenced forever? What if I told you that the shooter who pulled the trigger didn't scream, didn't confess, and didn't explain? He simply stood in silence, as if waiting for the darkness to swallow him whole. And what if I told you that when justice finally came, that silence cracked in the most unexpected way, leaving even the hardest hearts in the courtroom shaken? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This isn't just another story about crime and punishment. This is about a chilling assassination that played out in broad daylight, about a courtroom scene so dramatic people still argue about what they saw, and about a murderer who seemed untouchable until the weight of a single verdict crushed him to the ground. Charlie Kirk, a name you've heard before, a man who sparked admiration from some and fury from others. He wasn't the type to whisper his beliefs or soften his words. He thrived on confrontation, on stirring the pot, on riling up rooms filled with young people ready to hear his message. And on that fateful Wednesday in Orem, Utah, he was doing exactly what he always did, commanding a crowd, sharp, defiant, and unapologetic. But then, in a moment so fast yet so unforgettable, everything stopped. The sound of a rifle cracked through the open air. Gasps, screams, chaos. People ducked, people scattered. And within seconds, Kirk lay lifeless, his voice silenced in the most brutal way possible. Now pause for a second. Ask yourself, how does someone plan an act so brazen, so public, knowing that every eye is on them, every camera is recording, every witness will never forget? What drives a young man, just 22 years old, to pull a trigger that changes the course of so many lives? Was it ideology? Was it madness? Was it something darker that we may never truly understand? The name of the accused is Tyler Robinson, 22, barely older than many of the students in that Utah Valley University audience. A man now forever branded as the shooter who ended Charlie Kirk's life. But here's where things get strange. From the moment police had him in custody, he gave them nothing. No tears, no excuses, no confession, just silence. Imagine that, a nation demanding answers, a family demanding justice, a courtroom waiting for closure, and the man at the center refuses to give even a single word. But silence can only last so long. Because while Robinson sat stone-faced, investigators were busy piecing together the crime scene. A screwdriver found abandoned on a rooftop. A towel wrapped around the rifle used in the killing. DNA samples processed, matched, confirmed. There was no denying it. The evidence was speaking louder than Robinson ever could. And the voice of that evidence pointed directly at him. Let's not forget the gravity here. This wasn't just a shooting in the shadows. This wasn't a late-night crime where the victim is mourned quietly. This was a high-profile figure gunned down at a university campus, at a rally tied to a political movement that's been shaping conversations across America. The shockwaves rippled instantly. News outlets lit up. Social media exploded. Political camps braced for war. And yet, even in the midst of all that noise, the suspect sat silent. He did not confess. He did not cooperate. According to Utah's own governor, Spencer Cox, Robinson refused to give investigators anything. Not even the satisfaction of a motive. And that silence only made the question louder. Why? Why did he do it? Think about it. Killers often want their reasons known. They want their names remembered. They want their grievances aired. But Robinson? Nothing. As though the act itself was all he had to say. And so, when the trial began, that silence became a presence of its own. Journalists wrote about it. Family spoke about it. Prosecutors leaned on the evidence, because words from the accused were nowhere to be found. But justice doesn't wait for cooperation. It waits for facts. And fact after fact piled against Robinson until the inevitable happened. The verdict was read, and life behind bars became his reality. Now here's where the story turns from tragic to haunting. Because while everyone expected Robinson to meet the verdict with the same coldness he had shown throughout the trial, what actually happened left the courtroom stunned. The judge's words had barely landed when Robinson faltered. His knees buckled. His face went pale. He collapsed, as if the weight of the words had dragged him straight into hell itself. Imagine the scene. Family members gasping. Guards rushing. The very man who once stood with an air of defiance crumbling, not from a bullet this time, but from the realization that his own life, for all intents and purposes, was over. And here's the question that lingers. Was this collapse a medical fluke? Was it nerves finally breaking after weeks of silence? Or was it something symbolic, something darker, a glimpse of what it looks like when justice finally catches up to evil? This story isn't over. Because that collapse didn't just close the trial, it opened a new conversation. People walked away from that courtroom whispering not just about what Robinson did, but about what they saw when the verdict came down. Some say it was human weakness. Others say it was divine retribution. And still others believe it was the first sign of a man entering his own private hell. But here's the chilling part. That was only the beginning of what this case would reveal. Because while the courtroom gasped at his fall, investigators, families, and the nation at large were left with questions far more terrifying than one man's stumble. Questions about motive, about legacy, about what this crime really means for America. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. And if the nation thought the verdict marked an ending, they were wrong. Because what came next wasn't silence. It was the most emotional part of the entire saga, the voices of the families themselves. And when they spoke, the courtroom seemed to echo with something far more powerful than evidence or politics. This isn't just another story about crime and punishment. This is about a chilling assassination that played out in broad daylight, about a courtroom scene so dramatic people still argue about what they saw, and about a murderer who seemed untouchable until the weight of a single verdict crushed him to the ground. Charlie Kirk, a name you've heard before, a man who sparked admiration from some and fury from others. He wasn't the type to whisper his beliefs or soften his words. He thrived on confrontation, on stirring the pot, on riling up rooms filled with young people ready to hear his message. And on that fateful Wednesday in Orem, Utah, he was doing exactly what he always did, commanding a crowd, sharp, defiant, and unapologetic. But then, in a moment so fast yet so unforgettable, everything stopped. The sound of a rifle cracked through the open air. Gasps, screams, chaos. People ducked, people scattered. And within seconds, Kirk lay lifeless, his voice silenced in the most brutal way possible. Now pause for a second. Ask yourself, how does someone plan an act so brazen, so public, knowing that every eye is on them? Every camera is recording, every witness will never forget. What drives a young man, just 22 years old, to pull a trigger that changes the course of so many lives? Was it ideology? Was it madness? Was it something darker that we may never truly understand? The name of the accused is Tyler Robinson, 22, barely older than many of the students in that Utah Valley University audience. A man now forever branded as the shooter who ended Charlie Kirk's life. But here's where things get strange. From the moment police had him in custody, he gave them nothing. No tears, no excuses, no confession, just silence. Imagine that. A nation demanding answers, a family demanding justice, a courtroom waiting for closure, and the man at the center refuses to give even a single word. But silence can only last so long. Because while Robinson sat stone-faced, investigators were busy piecing together the crime scene. A screwdriver found abandoned on a rooftop. A towel wrapped around the rifle used in the killing. DNA samples processed, matched, confirmed. There was no denying it. The evidence was speaking louder than Robinson ever could. and the voice of that evidence pointed directly at him. Let's not forget the gravity here. This wasn't just a shooting in the shadows. This wasn't a late-night crime where the victim is mourned quietly. This was a high-profile figure gunned down at a university campus, at a rally tied to a political movement that's been shaping conversations across America. The shockwaves rippled instantly. News outlets lit up. Social media exploded. Political camps braced for war. And yet, even in the midst of all that noise, the suspect sat silent. He did not confess. He did not cooperate. According to Utah's own governor, Spencer Cox, Robinson refused to give investigators anything. Not even the satisfaction of a motive. And that silence only made the question louder. Why? Why did he do it? Think about it. Killers often want their reasons known. They want their names remembered. They want their grievances aired. But Robinson? Nothing. As though the act itself was all he had to say. And so, when the trial began, that silence became a presence of its own. Journalists wrote about it. Families spoke about it. Prosecutors leaned on the evidence, because words from the accused were nowhere to be found. But justice doesn't wait for cooperation. It waits for facts. And fact after fact piled against Robinson until the inevitable happened. The verdict was read, and life behind bars became his reality. Now here's where the story turns from tragic to haunting. Because while everyone expected Robinson to meet the verdict with the same coldness he had shown throughout the trial, what actually happened left the courtroom stunned. The judge's words had barely landed when Robinson faltered. His knees buckled. His face went pale. He collapsed, as if the weight of the words had dragged him straight into hell itself. Imagine the scene. Family members gasping. Guards rushing. The very man who once stood with an air of defiance crumbling, not from a bullet this time, but from the realization that his own life, for all intents and purposes, was over. And here's the question that lingers. Was this collapse a medical fluke? Was it nerves finally breaking after weeks of silence? Or was it something symbolic, something darker, a glimpse of what it looks like when justice finally catches up to evil? This story isn't over. Because that collapse didn't just close the trial, it opened a new conversation. People walked away from that courtroom whispering not just about what Robinson did, but about what they saw when the verdict came down. Some say it was human weakness. Others say it was divine retribution. And still others believe it was the first sign of a man entering his own private hell. But here's the chilling part. That was only the beginning of what this case would reveal. Because while the courtroom gasped at his fall, investigators, families, and the nation at large were left with questions far more terrifying than one man's stumble. Questions about motive, about legacy, about what this crime really means for America. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But silence can only last so long. Because while Robinson sat stone-faced, investigators were busy piecing together the crime scene. A screwdriver found abandoned on a rooftop. A towel wrapped around the rifle used in the killing. DNA samples processed, matched, confirmed. There was no denying it. The evidence was speaking louder than Robinson ever could. And the voice of that evidence pointed directly at him. Let's not forget the gravity here. This wasn't just a shooting in the shadows. This wasn't a late-night crime where the victim is mourned quietly. This was a high-profile figure gunned down at a university campus, at a rally tied to a political movement that's been shaping conversations across America. The shockwaves rippled instantly. News outlets lit up. Social media exploded. Political camps braced for war. And yet, even in the midst of all that noise, the suspect sat silent. He did not confess. He did not cooperate. According to Utah's own governor, Spencer Cox, Robinson refused to give investigators anything. Not even the satisfaction of a motive. And that silence only made the question louder. Why? Why did he do it? Think about it. Killers often want their reasons known. They want their names remembered. They want their grievances aired. But Robinson? Nothing. As though the act itself was all he had to say. And so, when the trial began, that silence became a presence of its own. Journalists wrote about it. Families spoke about it. Prosecutors leaned on the evidence, because words from the accused were nowhere to be found. But justice doesn't wait for cooperation. It waits for facts. And fact after fact piled against Robinson until the inevitable happened. The verdict was read, and life behind bars became his reality. Now here's where the story turns from tragic to haunting. Because while everyone expected Robinson to meet the verdict with the same coldness he had shown throughout the trial, what actually happened left the courtroom stunned. The judge's words had barely landed when Robinson faltered. His knees buckled. His face went pale. He collapsed, as if the weight of the words had dragged him straight into hell itself. Imagine the scene. Family members gasping, guards rushing. The very man who once stood with an air of defiance crumbling, not from a bullet this time, but from the realization that his own life, for all intents and purposes, was over. And here's the question that lingers. Was this collapse a medical fluke? Was it nerves finally breaking after weeks of silence? Or was it something symbolic, something darker, a glimpse of what it looks like when justice finally catches up to evil? This story isn't over. Because that collapse didn't just close the trial, it opened a new conversation. People walked away from that courtroom whispering not just about what Robinson did, but about what they saw when the verdict came down. Some say it was human weakness. Others say it was divine retribution. And still others believe it was the first sign of a man entering his own private hell. But here's the chilling part. That was only the beginning of what this case would reveal. Because while the courtroom gasped at his fall, investigators, families, and the nation at large were left with questions far more terrifying than one man's stumble. Questions about motive, about legacy, about what this crime really means for America. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. How could a man rise to speak, full of energy, commanding a crowd, and within seconds be struck down in front of everyone? How does a routine event, an open-air gathering of students and supporters, turn into a crime scene soaked in fear? That is the haunting reality of Charlie Kirk's assassination, a moment that shocked not only Utah Valley University, but the entire nation. It began as just another appearance, another rally for the co-founder of Turning Point USA. Students packed into the open-air space, some curious, some loyal, others there to challenge his views. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting a golden glow across the campus. The energy was tense, but electric, the kind of atmosphere Kirk thrived on. He leaned into the microphone, sharp and unapologetic as always. Cameras rolled. Phones streamed live. It was an ordinary Wednesday, for 5 minutes. Then the sound rang out. Not applause, not cheers. A rifle crack. One, then another. The kind of sound that cuts through the air and freezes every muscle in the human body. Screams broke out. Students ducked under benches. Bags and books scattered across the pavement. Panic erupted like a tidal wave. Some ran. Some fell. Some stood frozen, unable to comprehend that what they were hearing wasn't fireworks, wasn't a prank, but death itself descending on the stage. And there he was, Charlie Kirk, a man who made a living out of commanding his presence, suddenly collapsing. His voice cut short mid-sentence, his body jerking as bullets found their mark. Within seconds, his figure that had loomed so confidently over the crowd was sprawled lifeless on the stage. Can you imagine being in that crowd? Hearing a voice 1 second and seeing it silenced the next? Do you remember where you were the first time you heard about it? The footage spread instantly across the internet. The sound of that shot replayed, slowed down, analyzed, dissected. People around the world watched Kirk's final moments in real time, their jaws dropping, their hearts racing. Witnesses described it like a nightmare. A young woman later told police, "1 second I was filming him on my phone, and the next I was covered in someone else's blood." Another said, "I thought it was a joke at first. He always stirred drama. I thought this was staged. But then I saw the look on people's faces, and I knew." Police sirens cut through the chaos within minutes. Officers swarmed the scene, shouting commands, forcing terrified students to the ground, combing rooftops for threats. Helicopters circled overhead. Medics pushed through the crowd, their hands red within seconds as they tried to revive Kirk. But deep down, everyone already knew. Charlie Kirk was gone. Now here's the part that chills you. This wasn't random chaos. This wasn't an accidental discharge or a fight that spiraled out of control. No, this was calculated. The shooter had come prepared. Evidence later revealed that the rifle wasn't just carried casually. It had been wrapped, concealed with a towel. A screwdriver was found abandoned on a nearby rooftop, traced back with DNA. This wasn't chance. This was a plan. And think about the symbolism. A man who had built a reputation on fiery debates, on sparking culture wars, was not silenced in a quiet back room. but in the very arena where his voice carried the farthest. Shot down in front of young students. On a campus. At a place where free speech is supposed to thrive. The shockwaves didn't stop at the university gates. Across America, phones buzzed with notifications. Charlie Kirk shot dead. Conservative circles wept. Opponents were stunned into silence. Social media turned into a battlefield, with hashtags erupting, debates raging, rumors flying. But inside Orem that night, it wasn't about politics. It was about fear. Students crying in each other's arms. Parents rushing to pick up their children. Police cordoning off the campus. Chalk marks and blood stains telling the story that words could not. And yet, amidst the chaos, clues were left behind. The towel. The screwdriver. The evidence trail. While students were running for safety, the shooter was already thinking of escape, already dropping tools that would betray him. The shooter's name, Tyler Robinson, wouldn't emerge immediately. At first, he was just the suspect, the phantom figure authorities hunted in the hours after the shooting. Roads were blocked. Helicopters swept the area with searchlights. FBI units were dispatched. The university went into lockdown. Imagine that first night. Hundreds of students huddled in dorm rooms, scrolling endlessly on their phones, trying to piece together rumors. Was he caught? Is it safe to go outside? Who would do this? The sense of violation was overwhelming. For many, their campus was supposed to be a sanctuary of ideas. Now it was a crime scene. And that's the moment the story turned from shock to mystery. Because as police closed in on their suspect, they began to realize this wasn't going to be a case of quick answers. Tyler Robinson wouldn't give them that luxury. But before we get to the suspect, before we step into the courtroom, we have to pause here, at the scene itself. Because this assassination wasn't just about Charlie Kirk, and it wasn't just about the man holding the rifle. It was about a nation watching, asking itself how something like this could happen so brazenly, so publicly, in a place that was supposed to be safe. And the strangest part? This was only the beginning of the story. Because what investigators found in those first hours, the evidence left behind, the tools discarded, would unravel a chain of revelations that no one could have predicted. But the strangest discovery was still to come. And when it surfaced, it wouldn't just confirm the killer's identity. It would raise questions far darker than anyone dared to imagine. Why would a killer leave behind the very tools that could seal his fate? Why would someone bold enough to carry out a public assassination at a university, in front of cameras, be careless enough to scatter DNA breadcrumbs across the crime scene? That's the haunting question that investigators faced in the hours after Charlie Kirk's assassination. The chaos of that night was unforgettable. Police lights flooding the campus, helicopters slicing through the sky, students trembling in shock. But amid that storm, detectives weren't just trying to contain panic. They were already hunting for evidence, for the hidden story written in fingerprints, fibers, and genetic traces. And within hours, they stumbled upon the first clue that would unravel everything. It was a rooftop that drew their attention. Officers scanning the area spotted something out of place, a simple screwdriver, abandoned, lying in the open. At first glance, it looked ordinary. But any good investigator knows, nothing at a crime scene is ordinary. That screwdriver was taken into custody, bagged, tagged, and rushed to a lab. What came back would confirm the nightmare. DNA, not just partial, not just contaminated, but clear, traceable DNA. And not just on the screwdriver. Because within hours, another discovery was made. A dark-colored towel, suspiciously wrapped around the rifle believed to have been used in the shooting. Why a towel? To conceal it? To transport it unnoticed? Or perhaps to avoid leaving fingerprints? Whatever the reason, it was sloppy, because that towel carried more than fabric fibers. It carried the genetic blueprint of the man investigators were closing in on. Now pause for a moment. Think about what that means. The suspect thought he could cover his tracks, yet in trying to hide, he left behind the very evidence that would destroy him. Isn't it ironic? The very tools he relied on, his rifle, his concealment, turned into his betrayers. FBI Director Kash Patel broke the silence with a stunning announcement. Appearing on national television, on Fox and Friends, he didn't just confirm suspicions, he made it official. The DNA hits from both the towel and the screwdriver matched the suspect in custody, Tyler Robinson, 22 years old. The man already whispered about, already suspected, now definitively linked by science itself. Patel's words were chilling in their certainty. I can report today that the DNA hits from the towel that was wrapped around the firearm and the DNA on the screwdriver are positively processed for the suspect in custody. No wiggle room. No maybe. No doubt. And with that, the mystery took on a new dimension. Because while the public reeled from the news of Kirk's death, investigators knew they had a suspect whose DNA sat at the crime scene like a neon sign. But let's ask the question no one seems to want to ask. Why was the DNA there in the first place? Was Robinson sloppy? Was he overconfident? Or was there something more unsettling? Did he want to be caught? Did he want his identity exposed, his legacy tied forever to this act? Some argue Robinson was simply careless, panicked after the crime. Others believe he may have been arrogant, convinced that even with DNA, he could beat the system. But consider this, he didn't run. He didn't confess. He didn't shout his reasons. He simply shut down, silent, stone-faced, leaving his DNA to do all the talking. The weight of that evidence built the backbone of the prosecution's case. Every strand of DNA, every fiber pulled from that towel, every swab from that screwdriver painted the same picture. Robinson was there. Robinson handled the weapon. Robinson left behind proof that no defense attorney could argue away. Think about how powerful DNA evidence has become in our world. Forensic science has solved cold cases decades old. It's overturned wrongful convictions. It's caught serial killers who thought they'd gotten away. And in this case, it didn't just support the theory, it nailed it down. Without DNA, prosecutors might have faced a long battle of circumstantial evidence. With it, they had a slam dunk. But here's the contradiction that kept investigators awake at night. If Robinson was smart enough to plan an assassination, to wrap his weapon, to target a high-profile figure at a public event, how could he be foolish enough to leave behind such glaring evidence? Was it nerves? Overconfidence? Or something stranger? Picture the rooftop where the screwdriver lay. Wind rattling. The echoes of chaos below. Did Robinson drop it in panic as he fled? Did he abandon it deliberately, like a twisted calling card? These questions gnawed at detectives and, later, the jury. Because DNA solves crimes, yes, but it doesn't always solve mysteries of motive. Meanwhile, the public's appetite for answers grew insatiable. News anchors replayed Patel's statement over and over. Headlines screamed, DNA confirms shooter. Commentators speculated, why would a young man throw his life away? Social media erupted with theories, from political conspiracies to psychological breakdowns. But beneath the noise, one fact stood undeniable. The science was irrefutable. And yet, as investigators closed in, something eerie became clear. Tyler Robinson wasn't fighting the evidence. He wasn't speaking at all. His silence, paired with the damning DNA, created a paradox. He was guilty by science, yet mute by choice. Doesn't that make you wonder? If you were innocent, wouldn't you scream it? If you were wrongly accused, wouldn't you fight tooth and nail to explain? But Robinson? Nothing. Not a word. It's as if he surrendered, as if the evidence told the story he wanted told. But here's the haunting twist. DNA may have placed Robinson at the scene, but it didn't answer the deeper questions. Why Charlie Kirk? Why that night? Why in front of students? And most importantly, what was Tyler Robinson hiding behind that silence? The DNA was undeniable, the science airtight. But the motive? That remained locked away, sealed behind Robinson's stone face. And as the trial loomed, prosecutors prepared to wield that DNA like a sword, while Robinson prepared to give them nothing. No testimony, no confession, just silence. But that silence, as you'll see, wouldn't last forever. Because when the time came for the verdict, silence gave way to something no one could have predicted. And what happened in that courtroom stunned even the most hardened investigators. What kind of man faces the full weight of the law, a grieving nation, cameras flashing in his face, and chooses to say nothing? What kind of 22-year-old stands accused of assassinating one of the most controversial public figures in America, and instead of screaming his innocence, instead of confessing his guilt, simply stares back in silence? That's the paradox of Tyler Robinson, the silent suspect. From the moment police apprehended him, Robinson's demeanor baffled investigators. Most suspects, whether guilty or innocent, speak. They deny. They bargain. They ask questions. Robinson did none of that. He was led away in handcuffs after the shooting, his expression blank, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the walls of reality. Officers reported that he barely responded to commands. When asked basic questions, his name, his health, whether he understood his rights, he gave short, clipped answers or none at all. It was as though he had already decided that words no longer belonged to him. Governor Spencer Cox later told reporters that Robinson was not cooperating. Those words carried weight. Not cooperating didn't just mean refusing to confess. It meant refusing to help investigators connect the dots, refusing to explain motive, refusing to acknowledge the magnitude of what he had done. And that silence became its own kind of presence. It hung over the case like a ghost, haunting every attempt to make sense of the crime. But silence can be as loud as speech. Think about it. Every time Robinson sat in that interrogation room and stared at the table, every time he refused to answer a question, every time his lips remained sealed while DNA evidence piled higher and higher, it sent a message of defiance. Or was it defeat? Was he saying, "I won't play your game"? Or was he saying, "I have nothing left to give"? Psychologists who followed the case argued endlessly about his motives for silence. Some suggested he was a narcissist, relishing the chaos he had caused, refusing to explain himself because he enjoyed watching others scramble for meaning. Others believed it was trauma, that he was in shock even after the crime, that his mind had fractured under the weight of what he'd done. And still others whispered that maybe Robinson's silence was deliberate, a calculated strategy to avoid self-incrimination, to force the prosecution to rely solely on evidence. But ask yourself this. If your face was plastered across every news channel, if the world had already labeled you a murderer, wouldn't you fight back if you were innocent? Wouldn't you protest, scream, demand to be heard? Robinson didn't. And that, more than anything, convinced many that his silence was an admission in itself. In court, his silence became a spectacle. Every day he was led into the courtroom, shackled, dressed in the pale orange uniform that signaled his status as an inmate. And every day he sat without expression. No nods, no tears, no sudden outbursts. Reporters scribbled notes about his body language. Was he calm? Was he empty? Was he detached from reality? The nation debated endlessly. Families noticed too. Charlie Kirk's relatives sat across the aisle, eyes burning into Robinson, waiting for a flicker of remorse. They got nothing. Not a glance. Not a gesture. For them, his silence felt like cruelty, like a refusal to give them closure. One family member said outside court, "He didn't just kill Charlie. He killed our chance to ever know why." But Robinson's own family, too, was left shattered. Where were his parents? His friends? Did they know what was inside him, what he was capable of? Some reporters tried to track them down, but even they remained silent, either out of shame or fear. The silence seemed to spread like a contagion. Robinson silent in custody, his family silent in the press, the motive silent in the record. And silence, as we know, is dangerous. It allows speculation to fill the void. Commentators on television filled hours with theories, political radicalization, mental health collapse, personal vendetta. Social media added fuel, spinning conspiracies that Robinson was part of a larger plot, that his silence was proof of hidden handlers, that he had been programmed or coerced. None of it confirmed, all of it wild, but in the absence of words from the suspect himself, the world clung to whatever stories it could invent. Now let's step into that courtroom for a moment. Imagine the air heavy with expectation. Jurors file in. The prosecution lays out its evidence: the towel, the rifle, the screwdriver, the DNA. Each piece of proof presented with clinical precision. The defense, with little to argue, resorts to poking holes, questioning procedure, suggesting doubt. And in the middle of it all, the man who could answer every question sits in silence. Journalists called it eerie. One wrote, "It was like watching a ghost on trial." Another said, "His silence was more disturbing than any confession could have been." Because silence doesn't just withhold, it provokes. It forces everyone else in the room to project their fears, their judgments, their anger onto that empty space where words should have been. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Robinson's silence wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. For prosecutors, it meant they had to build their case without a confession, relying entirely on evidence. For the public, It meant they were robbed of the catharsis of hearing him admit his crime. For Kirk's supporters, it felt like one more insult from a man who had already taken too much. And yet, perhaps the silence was the only thing Robinson controlled. He couldn't control the DNA. He couldn't control the evidence. He couldn't control the trial. But he could control his mouth. He could deny the world the satisfaction of hearing anything from him. And maybe, in his twisted mind, that was victory. But silence is not invincible. Because silence cannot stop time. Silence cannot stop justice. And silence cannot stop the moment when the gavel falls and the verdict is read. As the trial moved closer to its conclusion, the tension around Robinson's silence grew unbearable. What would happen when the verdict was finally announced? Would he break? Would he finally speak? Would his silence hold, even as his life as a free man ended forever? The nation waited. Families waited. Jurors waited. And Robinson sat, still and silent, as if daring the world to guess what storm raged beneath his skin. But that storm would reveal itself soon enough. Because when the words life sentence echoed across the courtroom, Robinson's silence shattered, not in sound, but in something far more shocking. And what happened next would leave even the coldest observers shaken. When the doors to the courtroom opened, the air shifted. It wasn't just another day of legal proceedings. It was a stage, and everyone inside knew they were part of a performance whose ending had already been written, but whose impact no one could predict. Journalists filled the benches, their pens poised. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, some trembling, some glaring, some whispering prayers under their breath. Officers lined the walls, their eyes sharp, their hands resting close to their belts. And then, at the center of it all, the man who had brought the world to this moment, Tyler Robinson. He shuffled into the room in his pale orange prison uniform, wrists shackled, face still carrying that strange emptiness reporters had come to describe as his trademark. No emotion, no flicker of recognition when eyes locked on him, no apology in his posture. Just a young man, barely older than the students he'd terrified, sitting in silence, as if the trial itself were happening in another dimension. But silence doesn't stop time. And in that courtroom, every second ticked louder than the last. The judge presided from his bench, his face heavy with the gravity of what this trial meant. Not just for the families, not just for Utah, but for a nation grappling with yet another high-profile act of violence. The prosecution's table was stacked with files, evidence bags, and photographs too haunting for many to look at for more than a few seconds. The defense sat opposite, their client's silence leaving them with little to work with, reduced to the role of bystanders in their own play. And then came the witnesses. One by one, they stepped forward, their voices shaking as they relived the night that changed everything. A student described the sound of the gunfire. It didn't sound real. It sounded like the world had cracked. Another recounted the chaos, the rush of bodies trampling one another, the cries echoing as Charlie Kirk fell. A first responder painted the scene in brutal detail. The blood, the panic, the desperate fight to save a man whose life was slipping away before their eyes. Each testimony was a dagger, piercing deeper into the silence Robinson carried like armor. Yet through it all, he sat unmoved. No tears, no anger, no visible reaction, as if the words of those he had shattered couldn't touch him. But let's pause here. Ask yourself, what would you expect in that moment? A flash of guilt? A defensive outburst? Maybe even an attempt to justify the crime? But Robinson gave nothing. And in giving nothing, he created an even darker spectacle. It wasn't just the crime on trial. It was his very humanity. Jurors stole glances at him, their faces etched with unease. Could they see remorse? Could they see fear? Could they see anything at all? Reporters scribbled notes. Robinson unflinching. Robinson stone-faced. Robinson refuses eye contact. His silence wasn't just part of the trial. It was the trial. The prosecution hammered home the evidence. They held up the screwdriver found on the rooftop. They displayed the towel, stained and damning. They walked the jury step by step through the DNA matches, showing in painstaking detail how every thread led back to Robinson. Kash Patel's confirmation rang in the background like a siren. The DNA was his, the weapon was his, the crime was his. And yet, even as the case tightened around him, Robinson never once tried to defend himself. Not a single word in his own defense. No declaration of innocence. No attempt to explain his actions. Nothing. Imagine being in that courtroom. Imagine the frustration, the anger, the bewilderment. Families clutched tissues, shaking their heads, waiting for even one word that might make sense of the nightmare. But Robinson's silence only deepened the wound. A mother of one student whispered, "He's not even human." A man close to Kirk's circle muttered, "He wants us to suffer with questions." Still, the silence was not invulnerable, because silence cannot stop judgment. And here's the chilling part. People swore that the way he fell wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Some whispered it was as though the gates of hell had opened beneath him. Others insisted it was his soul finally buckling under the weight of his crimes. Whatever it was, it left the courtroom frozen in disbelief. And as he lay there, the gavel still echoing, the haunting question lingered in every mind. Was this collapse an accident of the body, or a glimpse of something far darker pulling him down? Because what came next would not just confirm his guilt, it would ignite a conversation that stretched far beyond the courtroom walls. The moment the jury filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere grew so heavy it was almost suffocating. Every pair of eyes fixed on them. Jurors who had sat through every gruesome testimony, every piece of evidence, every haunting replay of Charlie Kirk's final moments. They had heard the screams on the recordings, seen the photos of the bloodstained stage, and studied the trail of DNA that led directly to Tyler Robinson. Now, the weight of their decision pressed against the walls of the courtroom, and everyone inside braced for the words that would change everything. The foreman rose, clutching the folded piece of paper as though it carried not just a verdict, but the fate of a nation. The silence was unbearable. Families clutched hands, knuckles white. The judge's voice cut through the air, steady but grave. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreman nodded. "Guilty." The word cracked like lightning. Gasps echoed across the room. Some cried out. Some collapsed into tears. The Kirk family clung to one another, faces streaked with grief and relief all at once. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notepads. Phones lit up as the news blasted out in real time. Tyler Robinson guilty. For many, it was justice finally delivered. For others, it was the moment they realized there would never be true closure, because nothing could bring Charlie back. But the judge wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his expression solemn, his tone carrying the weight of finality. "Tyler Robinson, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." And that was when everything changed. Robinson, who had sat motionless through days of testimony, who had stared blankly as witnesses relived their trauma, who had refused to utter even a single word of remorse, suddenly cracked. At first, it was subtle. His shoulders twitched. His breathing quickened. The mask of calm he had carried for so long began to fracture. His lips trembled, though no words escaped. His eyes darted for the first time, searching, frantic, as though realizing that the walls of the courtroom had become his final horizon. Then, the collapse. His knees buckled, his body crumpling as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. Gasps exploded in the room. Guards rushed forward, trying to steady him, but his body fell limp, slamming against the floor with a thud that seemed to echo like a closing door. And in that moment, the silence of Tyler Robinson transformed. It wasn't defiance anymore. It wasn't control. It was surrender. It was the body of a man breaking under the weight of eternity. Imagine being there, watching this unfold. Families who had prayed for justice now stared in shock. Some wept harder, believing they had just witnessed divine retribution. Others whispered that it was a panic attack, the final unraveling of a young man who thought he could carry the burden of silence forever. But for many, the symbolism was undeniable. He hadn't just fallen to the ground. He had fallen into hell itself. Courtroom witnesses later described it with words that chilled to the bone. One said, "It was like watching the devil get dragged down." Another whispered, "His soul left him right there, in front of us." Even jurors, hardened by weeks of grim detail, admitted they shivered when Robinson collapsed. The medical team rushed in, kneeling beside him, checking his pulse, his breathing. For a moment, it looked like he might not get back up at all. But slowly, shakily, Robinson was lifted to his feet, his face pale, his eyes glassy, his silence now no longer chilling but pitiful. Still, the damage had been done. The image was burned into everyone's memory. Tyler Robinson, silent until the end, undone by a single verdict. The murderer of Charlie Kirk, falling like a man who had glimpsed eternity and lost. But here's the deeper question. Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or was it something darker, something beyond human comprehension? When we see a man collapse at the sound of his sentence, are we witnessing biology or justice? Theories erupted immediately. Some psychologists claimed it was a classic panic response, the nervous system finally breaking under months of tension. Others argued it was psychosomatic, that Robinson had so deeply internalized his silence, so fiercely suppressed every emotion, that the instant finality hit, his body couldn't contain it anymore. But to those who believed in fate, in karma, in divine judgment, it was something else entirely. The moment evil met its end. Because let's not forget, this wasn't just any crime. This was the assassination of a national figure, a man whose words sparked movements and headlines, whose presence polarized the country. The symbolism of Robinson's fall wasn't lost on anyone. Think about it. Charlie Kirk's voice was silenced in an instant. Robinson's voice was silenced by choice. And in the end, both fell, one to bullets, one to judgment. Isn't that haunting symmetry? But if you think the collapse marked the end of this story, you're mistaken. Because while Robinson lay crumpled on that floor, the world outside erupted. News channels replayed the footage endlessly. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForCharlie and #FallingIntoHell. Memes, commentary, outrage, and applause flooded every platform. And Robinson's collapse, far from being a mere medical episode, became the image of the trial. The guilty verdict was expected. The life sentence was inevitable. But the collapse? That was unforgettable. That was the moment that turned this trial from news into legend. But here's where it gets even darker. Because while Robinson fell in that courtroom, the unanswered questions about motive, about planning, about the true why behind his actions, remained untouched. The verdict brought justice, but not clarity. The collapse brought symbolism, but not closure. And the silence that Robinson had carried all along still echoed in the void. The trial was over. Justice had spoken, but the mystery had only deepened. And what investigators uncovered next in the evidence trail would raise even more disturbing questions. Questions that turned this case from tragedy into something even more chilling. What does it mean to watch a man crumble at the very instant justice is handed down? Was Tyler Robinson's collapse just a body buckling under stress? Or was it something more, a moment where the human mask slipped and something darker revealed itself? That single image, Robinson sprawled on the cold courtroom floor, became more than a medical incident. For some, it was proof of weakness. For others, it was proof of judgment. And for many, it was a symbol too chilling to shake. The sight of a killer falling into his own personal hell. The courtroom itself transformed in that instant. Moments before, it had been a chamber of law and order, solemn and structured, with the judge's voice dictating every second. But when Robinson collapsed, it turned into something else entirely, a theater of shock. Gasps filled the air. Reporters scrambled to their feet. Family members cried out. Guards lunged forward, their boots pounding against the floor. The sound of his body hitting the ground rang like a drumbeat of finality. And in that chaos, people didn't just see a young man faint. They saw a reckoning. Let's be clear, physical collapses in courtrooms aren't unheard of. Suspects faint when confronted with gruesome evidence. Defendants break down when they realize their freedom is gone. But this was different. Robinson hadn't cried. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't begged for mercy. He had sat through weeks of testimony like a statue, offering the world nothing but silence. And then, when the word life left the judge's mouth, he folded. As though the floor had opened beneath him. As though he wasn't just fainting, he was falling. Witnesses swore there was something unnatural about the way it happened. One spectator later told a journalist, it wasn't like a faint. It was like he was pulled. Another said, I've never seen a face go that pale, that fast. It was like the color drained out of him all at once. Even jurors admitted later that they had shivers watching him collapse. Some claimed it looked like justice itself reached out and dragged him down. And that's where the symbolism took root. Because in the court of public opinion, Robinson's collapse wasn't just about biology, it was about morality. To many, it was the universe balancing the scales. To others, it was karma, exact and merciless. And to some, it was a glimpse of divine punishment, the earthly body giving way to something the eye can't see but the soul can feel. But here's the paradox. While his fall gave people something visceral, something unforgettable, it also left behind new questions. Why now? Why then? Was his silence a shield all along? And did that shield finally shatter under the weight of a life sentence? Or was it the first moment Robinson allowed himself to feel the enormity of what he had done? Imagine the terror racing through his mind in those final moments of composure. Up until then, he had clung to the fantasy that maybe, somehow, he would walk free, that evidence could be challenged, that jurors could be swayed, that silence could save him. But when the gavel dropped, every one of those illusions was stripped away. No escape, no second chance, just a lifetime behind bars. For some men, that reality doesn't sink in slowly. It hits like a wrecking ball. Medical professionals speculated in the aftermath. Some suggested it was vasovagal syncope, an abrupt faint caused by stress. Others pointed to panic attacks, the nervous system crashing after weeks of pressure. Still others hinted at psychosomatic breakdown, the body rebelling against the silence Robinson had forced upon himself. But none of those explanations satisfied the public. Because for those who were there, it felt like more. It felt like a curtain had been lifted. And here's the haunting part. That moment didn't just belong to Robinson. It belonged to everyone watching. For the families of Charlie Kirk, it was validation. For the jurors, it was the exclamation point on their verdict. For the public, it was the image that would forever define this trial. Because justice isn't just about words. It's about moments that sear themselves into memory. And Robinson's collapse was one of those moments. But let's not overlook the irony. Robinson had chosen silence as his weapon. He refused to explain. He refused to cooperate. He refused to give anyone closure. But in the end, his body spoke for him. It screamed louder than any words ever could. His collapse became the confession he never gave, the ultimate betrayal of his own defiance. Think about that for a second. His silence said, "You can't break me." But his fall said, "I'm already broken." Isn't that the cruel twist? The very man who thought he could control the narrative by shutting his mouth ended up losing control in the most public way possible. And yet, the debate still rages. Was it just a feint? Or was it something more? Some insist it was a divine hand at work. Others believe it was a psychological breaking point. And a smaller, darker group even whispers about supernatural justice. That what people saw in that courtroom was the moment his soul began its descent into punishment. Regardless of what you believe, one thing is certain. That collapse wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. Because in that instant, Robinson transformed from a silent suspect into something else entirely, a symbol of guilt, a symbol of downfall, a symbol of the weight of justice pressing a man to the ground. And while the courtroom eventually cleared, while the gavel echoed one last time, that image stayed. In photos, in headlines, in the memories of everyone who gasped as they watched. Robinson's body hitting the floor became the story. More than the DNA, more than the testimony, more than the sentence. It was the fall. But here's where the story turns again. Because while that fall seemed final, the conversation it sparked was anything but. The collapse didn't close the book, it opened a new chapter. About Charlie Kirk's life. About the movement he left behind. About the legacy cut short in a flash of gunfire. And that haunting image of Robinson falling into hell would become the lens through which people examined everything that came after. Because if justice had claimed Robinson in that courtroom, what about Charlie Kirk's unfinished legacy outside it? That, my friends, is where the story goes next. Charlie Kirk. Whether you loved him or hated him, you knew his name. He was one of those rare figures who didn't live in the shadows of politics, but thrived in the spotlight, drawing fire from critics and adoration from supporters. He didn't just run Turning Point USA, he embodied it. His voice was sharp, relentless, and unapologetic. He was a provocateur, a strategist, and for many young conservatives, a leader. And when Tyler Robinson pulled that trigger on the campus of Utah Valley University, it wasn't just a man who fell. It was a legacy interrupted mid-sentence. Imagine the scene before the gunshots. Kirk stood tall, mic in hand, the crowd leaning into his words. He thrived in that atmosphere, Open air, a sea of faces, a mix of eager students and outraged hecklers. That tension, that was his oxygen. He lived for the clash of ideas, for the roar of applause and the sting of boos. He often said his job wasn't to comfort, it was to challenge. That Wednesday was supposed to be another notch in a long career of stirring debates and shaping narratives. Instead, it became his last. When news broke, it didn't take hours to spread. It took minutes. Within moments, phones buzzed across America. Charlie Kirk shot. Videos surfaced. Clips of his final speech went viral, framed with the deafening crack of gunfire. Supporters gasped in horror. Critics, stunned, fell silent. Even those who had spent years opposing his politics found themselves shaken. Because whether you agreed with him or despised him, one thing was undeniable. He was a force. And that force had been silenced in the most brutal way possible. But here's the thing about figures like Kirk. They don't just vanish. Their voices linger, their words replayed, their movements left scrambling in the vacuum. Turning Point USA wasn't just an organization. It was his creation, his stage, his megaphone. Without him, what happens? Does the movement crumble? Or does his death turn him into a martyr, fueling the very fire he spent his life stoking? History shows us something chilling. When leaders fall, they don't just disappear. Their absence becomes a rallying cry. Think of other assassinated figures, JFK, Martin Luther King Jr. Even controversial global leaders. Their deaths didn't end their influence. They amplified it. Their names became etched in the cultural memory, their legacies debated, dissected, and in some cases, worshipped. Could the same happen with Charlie Kirk? Was Tyler Robinson's bullet not the end of Kirk's influence, but the beginning of something far larger? In the days after the shooting, vigils sprang up across campuses nationwide. Candles flickered as students gathered, some crying, some angry, some simply stunned. The chants weren't just about loss. They were about continuation. Carry the torch. His fight lives on. In death, Kirk became more than a man. He became a symbol. But the interruption of his legacy wasn't just about what he left behind. It was about what he never got to do. His career was still unfolding. At 31, he wasn't fading. He was ascending. His speeches were drawing larger crowds. His influence was seeping deeper into politics. He was becoming not just a commentator, but a fixture in the conservative movement. What would he have built had he lived another decade? Another 20 years? We'll never know. And that's the cruelest part of this legacy, the potential cut short. Ask yourself this. Was that the point? Did Robinson see Kirk not just as a man, but as a growing force he wanted to extinguish? Did he realize that by pulling that trigger, he wouldn't just silence a voice, he'd create an echo? Because if that was his goal, the irony is brutal. In killing Kirk, Robinson ensured that his name will be remembered not just as an activist, but as a martyr of his movement. Turning Point USA faced its own reckoning. Without Kirk at the helm, who would take up the mantle? Could anyone replicate his charisma, his ability to draw both fury and loyalty? Leadership struggles loomed. Donors demanded answers. Supporters demanded direction. And critics, too, watched closely, wondering if the machine Kirk had built could survive without its engine. But beyond politics, think about the personal legacy. Kirk was more than headlines. He had a family. He had friends. He had people who loved him not for his firebrand speeches, but for his laughter, his quirks, his human side that never made it onto the stage. For them, the legacy interrupted wasn't about political movements. It was about memories left unfinished. Birthdays missed. Conversations cut short. Futures never lived. That's the tragedy no headline can capture. And yet, within that personal grief lies another layer of irony. Because while Kirk's family mourned, Robinson's family mourned too, but in silence, in shame, in shadows. One family lost a son to violence. The other lost a son to violence of a different kind, the violence he created. Two families, bound forever by a moment neither will ever escape. So what happens to Charlie Kirk's legacy now? Does it die with him? Or does it grow, fed by outrage and remembrance? History tells us that legacies interrupted are rarely legacies destroyed. They often become louder, more haunting, more impossible to ignore. And that's what makes this story so chilling. Because Tyler Robinson may have thought he was ending something. Instead, he may have ignited something far larger than he could have imagined. But if Kirk's legacy lives on in fire, then the question becomes, what of Robinson's legacy? What happens to the man who chose silence, who fell into hell in front of a nation? That question leads us straight into the darkest part of this story. Because if Kirk's legacy was interrupted, Robinson's legacy was something else entirely. A legacy of mystery, silence, and unanswered questions. And the motive that drove him to pull that trigger remains the single, most haunting shadow over this entire tragedy. Why? That single word hangs over every assassination, every act of violence that rips through a community. Why did a 22-year-old named Tyler Robinson decide to aim a rifle at Charlie Kirk and pull the trigger? Why that day at Utah Valley University? Why Kirk, a man who thrived on controversy but also lived surrounded by security, cameras, and witnesses? The evidence proved his guilt, the trial sealed his fate, but the motive, the reason, remains the darkest void in this story. From the very beginning, investigators knew they were dealing